Good evening, everyone, and welcome to U Talk. Now, last time we were here, we bored your ears off about the housing crisis and how artificial scarcity is causing us all a great degree of pain right now. Now, Kyle was very kind as to tease us with the other side of the coin on this, how the housing market is going to eventually relieve the pressure for quite some time to come. We're meant to
R-
be sad about the fact that rich people are going to get dicked over, right?
I'm not so sure about that part, but I will say that relieving the pressure is a very kind way of putting that. It's a very tame way of putting it. Um,
I am an excellent diplomat.
well, that was certainly diplomatic, but allow me to be, well, a little bit more of the warrior cast, good fire cast here, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, shit's gonna get whack, yo. And by that I mean everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. Everything's going to go downhill very fast. We're going to be up shit creek without a paddle. Now, all of that is those are all inflammatory statements. So let me explain that, because why the hell would I just not explain that? To me, it seems obvious. Um, and to you, it probably, you're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about. So here's roughly how it's going to play out. I did give a very brief version of this before, but this is roughly how it's going to play out. Adjustable interest rates, that is, people going from fixed interest rates and also interest only loan payments to then flexible interest rates, which means it basically goes up and down with the Reserve Bank's interest rates. So people very suddenly in April and May start paying much more on their mortgages. And it has been predicted so far, and I personally believe that the Reserve Bank is going to keep raising interest rates. And so that is going to put a whole lot of pressure on not just people, who are first home buyers who got in really late in the game, but also property investors and property developers. We've already seen projects put on indefinite hold due to the current economic conditions. We will see people go into increasingly negative equity, which essentially means that they will not be able to losing my train of thought here. I'm having a bit of an off day today. So we'll see people go into negative equity, which means the end result is they won't be able to pay off the loans. And we'll see that as the housing prices come down. So they borrowed, say, 700,000. Their house is now worth 650, or even 600,000, or even lower than that, as sort of an arbitrary example. Now imagine that, but on a very large scale, many people involved, and with houses worth anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million in Australia's two largest capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Then, so we've got housing prices drop as the Reserve Bank raises interest rates and people can no longer afford to buy a home. I mean, housing was already unaffordable, but as we eventually see the big drop off, and as people are unable to repay the loans, we're going to see a lot of defaults, a lot of bankruptcies, and that'll have a knock-on effect on both the banks and on businesses. Horst, which one should I talk about first, businesses or the banks?
You know what? I'd like to talk about businesses. Certainly in
Okay.
my area, we're seeing a lot of strain on small businesses, in parts because of the rental crisis affecting commercial properties, in part because of the general economic downturn, and in part because people can't afford to frequent those businesses.
Okay.
So I'm a little more concerned with what
So
happens to my mum and pop corner store than I am with what happens to the banks.
I'm glad you brought that up actually, because that's exactly the people who are going to be affected most by this. Um, your people who are, incredibly wealthy. We're talking ludicrously. They don't have like $1 million. They have, 5 million, 10 million. You're
Yeah,
ultra wealthy. The
they're
top
not going to
one,
notice this.
the top 1%. Yeah, they'll be like, oh, okay, we had a bit of a downturn. I made less money this year. Or maybe even I lost a little bit of money, but that's fine. It'll recover next year. The people who will go bankrupt from this are the people on the sort of lower end of wealthy. They're often referred to as middle class, but the current idea of the class of classes kind of, I think, is not really all that applicable. That's a whole other thing. Essentially, those people who are referred to as middle class, they work hard for their money, they have a business. Maybe it's the, as you said, mom and pop corner store, maybe it's a maybe it's it's mostly family businesses, or a couple of friends who have started a business about something they're all passionate about. So
Mhm.
these are businesses who might in revenue make only maybe less than 2 million a year, but there are, for each of those businesses, several people who depend on that business for employment. So we're looking at anywhere between say 3 and 10 people for each business that closes down. And a lot of these small businesses will close down. People won't have the money to spend on them. They themselves, if they have property investments, or if that, I mean, they'll be going into negative equity themselves. And let's just say that the best case scenario for them would be that they're able to keep paying their loan as is, even with the increased interest rates and the increased, or rather decreased business that they'll be having, because people won't be able to afford to spend as much money as at their business.
So that would
And
theoretically mean a large amount of foreclosures on businesses as well as on residential properties, wouldn't it?
well, yes, essentially, so it's almost it's not quite a feedback loop in that particular regard, but if one's affected, it does affect the other. So, if for, let's just, scenario, someone has a business, makes around 1.5 million a year, they have 5 employees, and they're doing pretty well for themselves. They got into the property market somewhat late, and so they're paying a very high mortgage. It's something like 1.5 million because they wanted to live in Sydney, close to where they worked. So they then, at that moment, interest rates are rising, and they can only barely afford to pay this as it is. Interest rates are
Mm-hmm.
rising, so they're now starting to take a loss overall. Their budget is in the red, and now their business is starting to take a hit because everyone else's budget is in the red. Well, what then do they have to do? Either they have to sell their property, and they've just probably entered negative equity at the same time, which means they could sell their property and they might not even get enough to pay back the loan because they were too late in the cycle. Their loans have only just started in the last couple of years. And that's effectively, they have to sell a house for less than they bought it for, and pay off a loan with essentially not even, well, there won't be anything left over to pay off the full amount of the loan for many of these people. So what we're looking at is them, best case scenario, they just make it through. Worst case scenario, they can't pay their loan. They sell their house to pay off part of the loan, or the bank, repossesses it, essentially the property to sell
Yeah.
themselves, and then they, I mean, that would probably even be a better scenario. Well, then again, it depends on. I'm not quite sure about the laws actually. I haven't checked into this yet, but I have been intending to. Perhaps you'll know. If the bank repossesses a property, is that just a loan called square there, or is it if the bank is able to sell the property for enough to cover the loan, is it square with the bank? How does that work?
Okay, so
Like, let's just say I had a property, 700,000. I paid off 50,000. I then was only able to sell it for 600,000. that last 50,000, or rather, the bank was able to sell it for 600,000. That last 50,000, do I still owe the bank that if the bank repossessed the home?
Yep, I understand that. I'm just quickly taking a look at the appropriate resources. So what happens is that when you have a repossession, you effectively repossess the good and the debt is considered dealt with. The bank may choose to then lease the property on its own. Like if you already have tenants, the bank may just say, look, terrible business that, but we're happy to keep the lease on because we can see that you're not causing us any problems and it'd be a shame to have to like screw around. There are a few cases of that happening, but in any case, as I understand,
it's
when
basically the
the good is
split.
repossessed, yeah, the good is
Okay.
repossessed in order to secure the debt.
Okay, so okay, I thought it might be that way, but again, good to actually know that now. I didn't get a chance to research that.
I'm just quickly checking on the exact process.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so you get a default notice. The lender repossesses. Okay, there are certain. They can theoretically, they can demand that you repay the remainder of the loan if the proceeds of the sale are insufficient to pay out the loan.
okay, so basically
However,
it's
however, if you think that the bank maybe didn't get the best price they could have, for instance, if they've sold your property for $400,000
and
in
it's
a
worth
market where
600,000.
550,000 is the minimum that you've seen recently, then you can say, oi, let's not have that. And you talk to the financial affairs ombudsman.
Okay, so basically you'd have to pay in most. Okay, so it gets the sort of branches off into a couple of different scenarios, but ultimately, even if they're able to sell it at market price, but market price is below what the balance of the loan is, you still have to pay the balance of the loan.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Okay. So, all right. So in that case, yeah. So in any case, in the scenario that I was talking about, let's call him John, who has this $1.5 million business, and bought or rather got a mortgage for $1.5 million late in the in the property market before it started declining. He's then looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, even after his house is no longer his, if he can't afford to keep up the payments, which for many people that will be the case. They for that not to be the case, they'd have to freeze rate hikes right now, and even then, we're still going to see the property market, the property prices collapse by up to 40%. It's really just a matter of when. My original prediction was 5 years ago that they would raise interest rates because that would be the responsible thing to do. And
they didn't, if I recall correctly.
They did not.
They held off for a little while.
For 5 whole years. And that, it shocks me that they, in fact, they cut interest rates right about the time where I was thinking that they were going to raise them. Again, because it would have been the responsible thing to do economically. But anyway, going sort of getting back to that. So that's the sort of business side of things. We'll see a whole lot of small businesses close, people laid off, unemployment rises sharply, lots of mortgage defaults, and basically if the business isn't doing well, then that stops them from being able to pay off the mortgage. And well, if they can't sell the property for enough, then they're still saddled with debt, which then has to be paid off through the proceeds of their businesses, which is in this scenario now lacking.
Mhm.
So essentially, it's long-term debt for small business owners who have gotten into the property market and bought a family home in the last, say, 2 years. So that's the scenario that we're looking at with businesses. Now we're going to run out of time soon, so I'll try and quickly go through the economic Armageddon that's about to happen. So that's that. Then there's the banks. So businesses restructure. That'll have kind of a knock-on effect with banks because businesses won't be able to pay off any loans that they have. Or they'll have to try and restructure their debt, which will be very difficult. Then mortgage is going to default, so the banks are out there. If they can't sell the properties for enough to cover the balance of the loan, then we're looking at and again, this is in a market where almost nobody wants to buy, and everyone who would want to buy is going to wait till the market's at its lowest. So effectively, we're going to see the banks lose out on tons of money, and then comes bail-in. Now, bail-in, as I mentioned in a previous episode, it was passed, I think, if it seems burned into my memory, the date February 12th, 2018, with 13 members in both houses of parliament combined, passed this legislation, which I think should be illegal, but we'll get into parliamentary structure and procedure another time. What we need to understand now is that after the banks have essentially taken this hit, well, there's three options or three scenarios for them. The first is that banks collapse. And, well, that's not going to happen because the big four banks, well, nobody's going to let them collapse. Politicians are indebted to them, financial donations to political campaigns and parties. Then there's the fact that, well, the economies kind of depend on the banks to be functioning.
Yes.
So the economy depends on that, and so there's two options: there's bail-in and there's bailout. They've on that with that. So what they did was they changed the APRA crisis resolution powers, but the language is vague enough that in order that it can conceivably be used to swipe a portion of people's savings and deposits in the event that the banks are in crisis. Now, where this has been tried more directly in other countries, it hasn't failed.
Worked very well.
Yeah, it's failed, and then the banks have needed a bailout anyway. So whether they get a bailout straight away or they go bail in and then bail out, the banks are still going to need that bailout. So they're going to need a ton of taxpayer money to stay afloat. And essentially, we're looking at just almost printing of money, really. We could end up seeing much more inflation. It really, in order to try and deal with that situation, you'd need someone who's much more well-versed in economics to come up with a solution than I am, because this is about where my knowledge is hitting its limit. I would not know quite how to fix that. To keep the banks afloat, we're looking at a whole lot of taxpayer money. Now, the last part, and we have run out of time, so I'll keep this very quick. The last part of this is the potential it has to pop the global derivatives bubble. Now, certain parties have estimated, and by parties I don't mean political parties, I mean groups of people and academics and experts in the field have predicted that the bubble of derivatives is about 5 times global GDP, which seems ludicrous. And so I'm still trying to get a clear answer on this, but the only thing I can find is estimates. And the highest estimates seem to all be around that figure. It's about 5 times global GDP. Now, there's a whole lot of financial mumbo jumbo, which essentially equates to these derivatives cancel out these derivatives, and there's a whole ton of other things. But if the derivatives bubble does pop, then we are still in for a world of hurt. Now, the part of it which I am the most worried about are contingent convertibles. my understanding is that a couple of years ago these were selling like crazy, and the idea was that in the event, like, these pay out really well, but in the event of a crisis, these turn into shares in a company. Like, these, again, the contingency in which it converts is a financial crisis, and it converts to shares in the company. And my understanding was that the banks were selling these like crazy. And so, depending on how bad that is, how many of those were sold, I'm expecting that not only will the liquidity of the banks dry up very quickly and they'll need a bail-in, but the value of shares in a bank will then be severely diluted, meaning that people who have their money invested in shares in those banks will also lose their money. So the big theme here, what sort of the through line with all of this, is that everyone is losing money. Money is essentially disappearing out of the economy, and the end result is probably going to be somewhere between 18 and 24% of the total wealth in this country disappearing within the span of about a year. That's about how bad it is. Now, 12% of that is just off the property price falls. Because
we're going to need citations for this, because this is awful.
That's going to be a lot of documentation that I'm going to need to find. I'm not even done getting the documentation of the videos that are already out yet. I'll get to it eventually.
We'll fix it in post.
Eventually. We say that, but I'm the one who has to do the post, and I don't have the time. I'll get it done. Anyway, we're way over time now, so we'll let you go. But essentially, I'll just say that the 12% of that, so 12% of the total value in the economy, total wealth in the economy, will disappear because housing prices drop by 40%, and about 30% of this nation's wealth, if not a little bit more than that, is invested in property. So if that drops, then that drops the total wealth in this nation. So that's about 12%. And the knock-on effect, which I just described the process of, worst case scenario, it might be anywhere up to 1.5 times that. But I expect it to be more, because we have what looks like a relatively decent government right now, who will probably come up with some decent policies and solutions to this. Not that there are real solutions to this. This is just, there is no stopping this stuff. I think it'll be somewhere between probably 18 and 24% of the total wealth of this nation that will disappear, essentially. I know everyone's probably hating me already, because it's like, hey, bad news. Anyway, we're way too over time. It's probably run at 17 minutes already. Meant to keep it to under 14. So we'll catch you later. Thanks for listening, and post your questions down below, and we'll answer them in a following video.